Now, in this next segment of this morning's message, I'd like to share with you a concept, a biblical approach to what we call isolation. Not just for the bad things that happen to you in a workout or competition, but even for the good things, to practice the principle of isolation. You know this from your own experience. No, I don't have to tell you this, but let me just point out 2 or 3 ways that it has happened. One thing can turn a game around, can't it? We call that the turning point of a game. For example, in the 1985 World Series, most of you high school kids weren't around probably at that time. Well, you weren't around unless you've been flunking a lot of grades. But in the 1985 World Series, they called it the I-70, the Interstate 70 Series, because it was between the Kansas City Royals and the St. Louis Cardinals. The Cardinals were the dominant team going into the World Series. They were the heavily favored team. They should have won the series 4-0. They were that much on paper better than the Royals. In fact, going into the 6th game, the Cardinals were leading in the series 3-2. They somehow let 2 games get away from them. In the 6th, and should have been the deciding game of the series, in the 9th inning, the Cardinals had a lead of 1-0. Kansas City was at bat. The hitter for Kansas City dribbled the ball back to the pitcher, Todd Warmack, or Worrell, was it? Worrell. And he fielded just like a pitcher should. Many times he's done this. Threw it effortlessly to first base, to Jack Clark at first base. And everybody can see the runner's out. The umpire didn't see it that way. He was blinded by the vision that he had there because of someone in his way, and he called him safe at first. The entire Cardinal team erupted in anger. The manager is beside himself. You've got to be kidding! People who weren't in the game at the stadium could have seen this. And Cardinals, the veins were popping and they were mad, but the umpire could not reverse his decision. The TV cameras showed that he was out. The TV cameras, every replay, every angle, he's out. But he was safe because that's what the umpire said he was. And so with the runner on first base, the Cardinals just fell apart. They couldn't believe it, that an umpire made that kind of mistake. And it's costing them with a runner. Instead of focusing on getting the next guys out, they completely fell apart. Kansas City scored 2 runs, won that game 2-1. And in the papers after the game, the media reported after the game, all the interviews after the game, all the Cardinals could do was focus on the bad call by the umpire. And instead of preparing for the 7th game of the series, in which they should have easily beat the Royals, they kept bellyaching about the bad call in the 6th game. In the meantime, the Royals were focused in on what they needed to do. And they whipped the Cardinals in this final game of the series 11-0. A turning point. Talked about Gordon Thiessen's high school team, the zero defense. A bad turnover, an unexpected turnover right in the first part of the game cost that team to lose the game because their attitude went down the drain when they didn't have a shot at the perfect season of shutting a team out. Turning points. It happens all the time. A pitcher is pitching a no-hitter. 7 innings of perfect no-hit game. A guy gets a little dribble hit, just a little scratch hit. And what happens, instead of the pitcher going on and really concentrating and pitching a shutout, many times he gets blown out of the pitching, off the pitching rubber. He loses it because he lost his focus. So guys and gals, what I'd like to share with you here is a concept out of the book of Philippians. And if you could, turn to Philippians 3:13 and 14. And in your particular Bible, that's on page 1157. But it's Philippians 3. That's you're not always going to have this Bible with you to know the page number. And there's a lot of passages on this page. So remember, it's Philippians 3, verses 13 and 14. And let's start with 12. Not that I have, this is Paul writing now, not that I have already reached the goal or am already fully mature. This is Paul writing. Paul, if you're not fully mature, how in the world do you expect me to be fully mature in the Lord? And you see, guys and gals, it's a process. It's a lifelong process. Not that I've already reached the goal or am already fully mature, but I make every effort to take hold of it, because I also have been taken hold of by Christ Jesus. Brothers, meaning Christian followers of Jesus, fellow followers, I do not consider myself to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and reaching forward to what is ahead, I pursue as my goal the prize promised by God's heavenly call in Christ Jesus. You get the concept of isolation out of there? Something bad happens in a game. You forget about that happening and you pursue representing Jesus Christ. Something good happens in a game. You forget the good what happens and you pursue representing Jesus Christ. Try doing this. Think of a red-faced monkey. A red-faced monkey. That's a blushing monkey. Okay, you got that in your mind? Now, if I say don't think of the red-faced monkey, you're not going to be too successful in not thinking of the red-faced monkey. But if I tell you, now think of a blue-faced elephant. Get the blue-faced elephant in your mind. And if you're really focusing on a blue-faced elephant, the red-faced monkey is not in your mental perception anymore. But if you're still seeing that red-faced monkey, what that tells me is you're not totally focusing on the blue-faced elephant, because your mind is designed by God, and my mind is designed by God to only focus 100% on one thing at a time. Now, we could focus on a lot of things, and there's 20% here and 30% there and 20% there, and we're kind of fragmented, like Ron showed with his conversation with Chris last night, kind of a fragmentation type thing. But you can only focus on one thing. So how do you forget what's behind? It's already in your mind. It's etched in your mind. You're feeling terrible about making the error. You're feeling terrible about the demotion that you just had. How do you forget that? By focusing on what God now wants you to focus on and give that focus 100%. And that's to represent Jesus, to talk with Jesus, or we call chattering, but to keep talking with Jesus about now what shall we do? Now what shall we do? And if you are still thinking about the past that just happened, all that tells you is a tip-off that you're not totally focusing on Jesus himself. Because if you were totally focusing on Jesus, you couldn't be thinking about the past. Now, folks, I'm not saying that just for the bad things. I mentioned earlier, it's about the good things too. Each part of the competition is a new crusade. I had a volleyball girl from Branson come up to me. She was all-state. And she was now a freshman at Southwest Missouri State, and she was not starting. She had the ability to start as a freshman, but she wasn't starting. And she was kind of complaining to me, the coach isn't giving me the chance. And so I asked her, I said, Amy, someday you want to be in the Olympic Games, don't you? And she said, I sure do. I said, then why don't you take each practice session as your Olympic Games? Treat each practice session as your Olympic Games. Give each practice session your total release of doing it Jesus' way. And that's your Olympic Games. In a week's time, she was starter for her team because her coach could not keep her down. She had enthusiasm in the routine workouts where all the other players were just going through the workout. She had encouragement for her teammates. She had drive, and she did the things that she needed to be in the Olympic Games because those were her Olympic Games. So how do you isolate? You focus on the next thing as your Olympic Games, as your playoff games, and you give it all the enthusiasm to partner with Jesus. In our training center that we had out in Prescott, Arizona, we had kind of a fun time out there. We'd learn these principles in the morning and then go out as a staff, go out in the afternoon and play tennis or football or baseball or basketball or golf or whatever. And I would assign a different of my staff to be the coach for that day. In other words, his job was to coach the rest of us in applying these principles. The goal, the winning, the audience, the motivation. And so I had Dan Roberts, one of my staff, say, Dan, you're going to coach us through this round of golf. And so he was the first one up on the first tee, and he slices the ball right in some guy's garden, and Dan doesn't say a word after he slices that ball. Hits it so poorly. Walks to his bag, picks out another ball, tees it up, boom, slices it right out there again, right in the exact same place the other one hit. I mean, about a yard separating the two. He was the least consistent. He didn't say a word. And I didn't say a word. He's the coach for the day. And he tees up a third ball. This time he doesn't put it out of bounds, but he dribbles it about 30 yards down the fairway. Just dribbles it. And so every one of us tees off and we walk down, and I'm walking about 5 yards from Dan. He's still not saying a word. He's our coach, and he's not saying a word because he's caught up in his own failure. And finally he looks at me and says, "Don't say a word, Wes. Just don't say a word." And he's just sullen, and he walks on ahead. And he dribbles the ball and hits the ball in the trees. And he ends up on the first hole with a 12. We walk over, he's still not saying a word. He's our coach. He's trying to coach us in these concepts, but he's having to struggle with them himself. And he hits the second tee out of bounds again. And finally he turns around to me and says, "Okay, Wes, what should I be thinking?" I said, "Dan, you're the coach. You tell me what you should be thinking." He says, "I don't have a clue right now. I'm so frustrated." I went over to him and I said, "Dan, you go around speaking a lot at banquets. What if an athlete came up to you after your talk on this great motivation of doing things Jesus' way, and it sounds so good ideally, but this guy's had a struggle, and he describes for you the exact same scenario that you've been experiencing out here. What would you tell him to get out of that? What would you tell him?" And Dan just looked at me and said, "Let me think about it." And he walked off, and pretty soon he hits the next shot down the fairway. Hits the next shot onto the green. And then from that point on, for the next several holes, he played par and bogey golf, which was his standard. And he's smiling again, and he's coaching us again. And I went up to him and I said, "Dan, what made the difference today? Now you're putting it all together when you were having a disastrous first couple holes." He said, "I thought about what you said, advice I would pass on to an athlete who was experiencing the same thing." And I said, "Well, what was the advice?" And he said, "Hey, you knucklehead, get back to the basics." I said, "That's what you would have told him?" I said, "Yeah, that's what I would have told him. Hey, knucklehead, get back to the basics. What's your goal? What's winning? Who's your audience? And let's talk about motivation again. Let's get back to the basics. Let's don't feel sorry for ourselves that we're messing it up out here. Let's start reevaluating here. Lord, am I really representing you, or am I just into myself? Lord, am I really giving an effort the way you would give it, or am I just doing it feeling sorry for myself and I'm having one bad shot after another?" And he said, "That's the key. Get back to the basics, and that will get you out of the past." Good advice. Goal, winning, audience, motivation. Know what those are. Had an all-pro football player come up to me one time, and he was describing what happened in a game. He was playing for the San Diego Chargers at the time, Ed White. He won a lot of the strong wrestling, strongman contest in the NFL, arm wrestling. One of the strongest men in the NFL. And he said a guy took a cheap shot against him in a game. And all he wanted to do was on the next play, go out of his way and boom this guy to teach him a lesson. Don't pick on the strongest guy in the NFL and live. I said, "Did you do it?" He said, "No, I didn't do it." I said, "Why didn't you do it?" He said, "Because I'm representing Jesus out here." He said, "I wanted to do it. I was trying to rationalize that it would be okay to do it, that Jesus wanted me to do it, in fact. But I know he didn't. I know if I would have taken the revenge and not allowed God to have his revenge, then I would be hurting my team, could even penalize my team for my actions. And in order to contribute to my team, I had to focus on my next assignment." He isolated by focusing in on representing Jesus in his next assignment.